Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Fellows Talk at Slavery North. My name is Charmaine Nelson. I'm a Provost Professor of Art History here at UMass Amherst in the Department of History of Art and Architecture. I'm also the founding director of the Slavery North Initiative. And what we are is a public-facing initiative, the first step to becoming an institute or a research center. And we fund and support scholarship on slavery in Canada and slavery in the US North. The heart of what we do is our wonderful fellows program, and each of our fellows does a public-facing lecture during their residency with us. So today we're really happy to welcome Professor Alex Callender. Before I introduce her, I'll just let you know there will be one more spring semester fellows talk coming up. That's Dr. Kathy Foley-Meyer, who will be giving her talk also hybrid on May 2nd at 3 o'clock. So we hope that you can also join us either in person here on the UMass Amherst campus. Fine. Now, Dr. Callender is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to questions and discussion for the last 10 to 15 minutes. Let's see here. So I'll just introduce Professor Callender. Professor Callender, her practice uses methods of drawing, painting, and installation to trace and remap historical materials as a means to explore with both criticality and care how we might disentangle the interwoven relations of race, gender, and capitalism. She has had solo exhibitions and projects at Island Gallery, which is in New York City, Art Yard in New Jersey, the Center for the Arts, Northeastern University, UMass Contemporary Museum of Art, NYU Gallatin Galleries, and Michigan State University's Lookout Gallery. Alex has received artist grants from the Pollock-Krasner Foundation and the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and has held artist residencies and fellowships with Women's Studio Workshop, MacDowell Colony, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Drawing Center, Art in Embassies Program, Vermont Studio Center, Santa Fe Art Institute, Alice Yard in Trinidad, and Draw International, and the Bow Institute in France. She is currently an associate professor of art at Smith College, and today her talk is called Imaginative Geographies and Radical Annotation. I'll hand it over to Professor Callender.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm gonna sort of clumsily share my screen. Share. Okay. Slideshow. Okay, from start. I'm just gonna mention, because I think it's that I don't have a PhD, I'm not a doctor.
Okay.
And I say this also because I think that my approach to what is considered sort of like research or research-based studio practice has ambiguities in it that I think is probably different and outside of other traditional kinds of scholarship. And thinking about the archive or historical materials for me is less maybe, or doesn't really involve a place of sort of getting to a truth or proving something necessarily. I think that there's way more efficient ways than through a painting to kind of like prove a historical argument. And instead, I'm kind of thinking about how historical materials hold imagination. They were formed through imagination, and then kind of the imaginative spaces that we can potentially kind of like work with them to produce. And so I'll just kind of say that. I'm going to kind of start a little bit. I'm a painter and drawer and work a little bit in installation. And the work that I'm kind of going to be showing today has really been made in the past year or so, and is particularly around this project that I'm calling American Lawn, and kind of extends into the work that I'm doing here. And just to kind of parse out the projects, I kind of decided to allow things to kind of like overlap in terms of my research here that's sort of ongoing. And so we can say, like, what are imaginative geographies? Can imaginative geographies be different from American-centered racial and ecologically supremacist myth stories that have been depicted in historical accounts or imagined through the archive? Because those are also kinds of imaginative geographies, right? And so here's the kind of ambiguity that is already at play. Could a refusal or a rethinking of linear historic time help us when connecting Atlantic history's racial capital and the current climate crisis? So also within this project, I'm really sort of thinking about the afterlives in a very present sense of Atlantic slavery and the slave societies in which it made, and the way in which that relates to our ecological present. And is that partially what the work of ghosts do, or what haunting does? And so I'll talk a little bit about the idea, a little bit of like the refusal of linear historic time and the idea of ghosts in my work. And just to kind of start us off, this is the image that's on the screen is one of the sequences from the Views of North America. I will spare everybody my pronunciations in French. It is actually a French wallpaper produced by a French company, Zuber, and I'll just say everything in English. So designed by Jean-Julien Deltil and inspired by the illustrations or published lithographs of Jacques-Gerard Milbet. The Views of North America is published and manufactured by the Zuber Company in 1834. And I first came across this wallpaper kind of years ago at this point at the Zuber Company, the Museum of Wallpaper, the Paper Piant Museum in Eastern France near Alsace. And this was one of the panoramic wallpapers. And I was actually there looking at a different panoramic wallpaper for a different project, but saw this and was kind of really captured by this particular panel, which takes place at West Point. So the Views of North America were these like kind of 6 panels of American, sort of emerging American kind of touristic moments that could be identified, since it was sort of a French produced paper, and that kind of historically referred to as Scenic America. It requires 1,690 printing blocks and 223 colors and 32 lengths. It's like a total of 49 feet. So it's actually like in terms of its printing, it's kind of magnificent, and the color and the technology that's happening at that time. I think a bit of my interpretation of it, especially sort of this panel, is the West Point Academy scene in particular. The scene of families is depicted promenading around military line exercises at West Point. Imagery featured in the Zuber's 1834 panoramic wallpaper Views of North America. The figures are imposed as a ground or foundational myth, now covered by a mix of what would have been at this time, if the lawn hadn't kind of like concealed that space, a mix of wild aster, bluegrass, blue stem grasses, and here we have sort of like this turf, right, that sort of kind of covers and envelops the space. The historical memory inside of Zuber's illustrated views of pastoral New England and New York, produced during the Jacksonian era, tell a more complicated story where site, S-I-T, and site, C-I-T, expand to reveal the plantation geography of the Caribbean as part of the ghostly doppelganger of the North Americans' economic ascendance. So for me, that kind of became a little bit at the heart of this project. Was here you have this scene of this sort of like upwardly mobile families and kind of like passerbys on like a Sunday afternoon watching sort of military exercises at West Point. The wallpaper is, I think, a little bit is sometimes viewed as sort of controversial as these Black figures emerge that were taken from other circulating Atlantic print materials, possibly like these Sloan drawings, in which they're kind of like these caricatures in abolitionist broadsides. But here they're sort of depicted in sort of like a Sunday dress. So we have sort of like this upwardly mobile, sort of like mixed race, sort of new American, sort of people kind of passing by the space. And there's something about the fiction of it that was really interesting to me, right? So we're in the Jacksonian era, and so we kind of know that this would be a much more sort of like fraught space. Even though there are sort of free and middle class Black people, like what is the scene trying to do? And sort of staging it within this military context also felt really interesting, the sort of overlap of sort of settler space, militarism, and a kind of multiracial citizenry that's sort of proposed in here. So I was sort of interested in it as this kind of place in which there's a kind of fiction. And so what could be made in that space? Here's one of the preliminary paintings for it. And I think it kind of already imposes a place of like imaginative geography. So you have this sort of like West Point scene that is on the other side of this crest or hill, next to the view of Boston Harbor, which is sort of like the next panel in the piece. So we go right from this sort of center of a kind of upper class military lieutenant world that's going to be going out and sort of doing different ambassador and different kind of things for the United States, and then also another economic center sort of right next to it. So the places that are chosen are sort of like quite specific. So here was one of my first kind of thinking and re-renderings of this piece, called Unsettling Palimpsest Even Haunts the Grass. And I'm thinking about the kind of like when we see a scene of this sort of lawn, the kind of erasure and then sort of implantation of a settler economy and the kinds of different grasses that would be productively there or would be living there, and then like sort of what gets replaced or what gets taken away, as we have this sort of expanded lawn field that is one kind of gives us and these sort of like annotations of the capacity for like an extended viewpoint and surveillance, right? And the ability to kind of see a wide space. So common evening primrose sort of leans into what is Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, and tall fescue, which were probably one of the mixtures that would be used for that grass and is commonly used as sort of like long grasses in the Northeast. They're really short stem rhizomatic grasses, so they take a lot of water and don't really produce nutrients or kind of do anything productive for the soil or anything generative for the soil, which is why lawns are kind of these, in the way that we use them commercially, kind of this ecological wasteland a bit. And kind of thinking about wild primrose is like a long rooted grass. It supports birds and hummingbirds. It feeds lots of smaller animals. It helps with sort of like the long root helps with soil erosion and regeneration. So it has all of these other kinds of capacities. Lawn grasses that are, in addition, Bermuda grass, bent grass, St. Augustine, those would be grasses that would kind of be like below a certain like Oklahoma kind of like latitude, right? So these different grasses have kind of been designed to look the same in different ecological zones. And if anybody's interested, there's this great book called The Lawn: A History of an American Obsession by Virginia Scott Jenkins. And it's interesting to think also that sort of like this period right now where there's sort of like this extended space of a lawn, like in a more kind of ideological space, is not something that would have happened in actually like early colonial renderings of the space. It's something that kind of gets introduced in the mid-19th century as a way of kind of delineating space, and then is kind of like replaced all throughout sort of like New England landscapes. And it kind of feels like it's always historically been part of our place, but it's actually kind of invented into the space. Are we meant to wave our arms? So the project kind of emerged a little bit, and I'll bring how the kind of this imaginative space of the kind of Caribbean sort of weaves in here. What I've found is that when I was studying grasses, that actually is a project that kind of popped up at UMass a few years ago, and thinking about the different kinds of really important ecologically important grasses, is that sugarcane is also a grass. And sort of like as a main plantation economy crop is a grass. And I began thinking about how some plants, like this way that some plants are sort of brought into these stories of human violence, right? And then there's some plants that kind of experience this sort of erasure. And these different ways that we imagine a kind of public and private ecology are also starting to emerge at the same time as racial formation, right, alongside with. And the way that non-human sort of like plants and animal actors that I'll talk about later become these kinds of familiars in the story that's unfolding. So these are graphite on black paper. And so for me, when I'm using graphite on black paper, it signifies a kind of spectral presence because of the reflective capacity of the graphite. So I do think of it as a place for a kind of living space to emerge. And this, I think for me, is helpful in designating in some of the larger paintings when I also am involving graphite to kind of like start to mark a little bit of the space in the characters. So I was looking at different herbariums as I was sort of tracking different kinds of grasses. And for me, it was sort of being in the landscape and looking at grasses, but then also thinking about these specimens that become made at this time, right, through kind of colonial capture, and how one would bring them back to life, and like through drawing or through a painting project, sort of like bringing them back to life a bit. So this piece is a cyanotype. So the other part about the project that I'm talking about is that it's a series that mostly takes place between dusk and dawn the next day. And I think about this as a time in particular where we can think about haunting as very present. And sort of that space of, for me, historical materials, the archive become a place of haunting. So those places can kind of emerge. So I use multiple kinds of blues and cyan and indigo, which was a new palette in the series that's a bit new for me. And so I was thinking about the lawn also in this particular piece, and then in the larger way of thinking about it, sort of as like an ideological construct, as a kind of blueprint of space making, and also sort of like racialized space making. One of the other things that kind of became emergent in this project is kind of going back a bit to Glissance, the poetics of relation, and the concept of errantry. And I think I've kind of revisited this more very recently. A friend kind of made me think about this again. The thought of errantry as a poetics, which always infers that at some moment it is told. The tale of errantry is the tale of relation. And without turning this into an Edward Glissant sort of like reading circle, I to think about when I was talking about sort of like the refusal of like a historic kind of linear time, that the thinking about errantry, I think, kind of really allows for this, right? To kind of like follow these corridors of materials as I find them, and then their relation. And that those are both historically and sort of like personally and familially kind of bound. So that's the kind of structure that I'm taking in this when I talk about sort of my relationship to the archive and to history. And so yeah, again, in the series, we're kind of like thinking about night. So at this time of night, there is no place or the other, and I see you clearly. So I kind of think of it as this place in which spirits or ghosts or haunting are able to kind of confront history, right? And sort of it becomes this particular kind of material place where that can happen. And before I'll kind of come back to what we were looking at in that image. But one thing that also I started to think about in as the series kind of emerged was also about sort of optics and sightlines. And I think that really comes again from that first, the view of the kind of West Point and sort of like that really open plain and thinking about sort of colonial optics and the stereoscope as this tool that kind of emerges and is a lot of the ways that I was looking at sort of materials in the archive. So this is, you probably recognize the stereoscopic image that the figure in this piece is holding is from a pineapple plantation in Cuba. It was part of a stereoscopic collection that I saw at the Schomburg. And I'm sort of imagining this figure kind of like holding it, emerging through the landscape. And an interesting thing also about the Views of North America is that it was installed in the White House under the Kennedy administration, and then sort of refurbished under the Obama administration. And I think that we also know the history of the White House and the people who built the White House, right? Enslaved Americans, the White House. And so the other thing that is kind of at play in here, and this is where errantry comes in. So a lot of this is kind of like staying with me here, right? So as I was starting to think about like, so this wallpaper is produced in 1834. What's actually happening in 1834? Do I know? And can I think a little bit about that? And I think that's how also when I find like a kind of compelling piece of either visual historical kind of culture and this idea of like myth that's existing in it, like how do I understand what might also be happening? And so I started to think about the emergence of the continuing kind of emergence of the Northeast and the economic kind of engine of the Northeast, and it's intertwined, not just dependent is sort of like a lackluster word, right? Like it's completely intertwined with the Atlantic slave trade, and particularly in the Caribbean, and in the sort of like 17th century. And so I'm sort of thinking about this, and was thinking about how I might start to kind of like understand a bit more in, 100 years in, and sort of like 1834, what the culture of the people kind of coming out of West Point, sort of what their relationship to transatlantic industry and sort of American power, and where that might kind of like move towards. And so as I was looking at sort of more and more colonial records, mostly in merchant logs, mostly at the Baker Library at the Harvard School of Business, the relationship between both New York, but New England and Boston and Cuba became really apparent. And so as I was sort of like going through one of the merchant ledgers and sort of starting to understand some of the families that I was looking at, I actually saw that West Point kind of pops up in the letters between the Russell Edward Jenks paper, who is a kind of contemporary of James DeWolf, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And the passing of sort of a contemporary at West Point. And so this idea that people who were both in the position of trafficking or benefiting from the commercial or both of people and products and commerce coming between New England and the Caribbean were sort of in this world with each other. And so that's where I sort of position the figure that's sort of emerging through this space as a place of kind of confrontation. One of the ways that I sort of came to this place of thinking about imaginative geography or imaginative kind of placemaking is I was giving an artist talk several years ago and had been working on this piece that was based on the John Copley Watson and the Shark painting from 1778. And one of the art historians at the Boston MFA kind of came up to me later and was like, because I was saying in the talk that I had always sort of thought of Watson the Shark as taking place in Boston Harbor. And then, of course, learned later that it was in Havana. And so, and I was kind of talking about this in the artist talk, and the one of the art historians came up to me and was like, well, it's interesting you say that because we actually think that he possibly meant it to be both places. Because Boston and Cuba and in the mercantile society were so intertwined, that there was sort of like this idea, again, of this sort of imaginative geography that it sort of functioning as sort of both places. Watson, who commissioned this, of course, lives and goes on to be sort of a banker, I think, at Lloyd's of London. And at the same time, I think that this was happening, there was this wonderful kind of like circulating image of this very, very old Greenland shark, who was almost 400 years old. And so I was also thinking about, again, that sort of like presence of sort of like non-human sort of familiars or that are in the story, that the shark itself was sort of like this time traveler, right? Like that even though Greenland sharks sort of really occupy northern waters, that this is sort of this being that has been here for almost as long as the sort of this Atlantic history that we continue to kind of like reconcile with. So I started to see somehow between them as this place again for like what happens when we merge spaces, right? And we kind of like refuse this sort of linear time. So this is from a collection of images of the National City Bank of New York in sort of the early and the mid 20th century that create banks in various architectural styles throughout the Caribbean. And I was kind of, again, this sort of like ongoing relationship. And so I made a drawing of it. And then I was thinking about sort of the National City Bank that pops up. The National City Bank is established in 1836. So it's another sort of like piece that's moving around during this time period. Is established in 1836 and at 55 Wall Street. And it's sort of like one of the original views before it goes on to be the building that we're more familiar with now. Which is that sort of it's redone in 1836 to 18 sorry, it was first made between 1836 and 1841, and then it's sort of like refurbished and it's made higher by McKim White, Mead and White in 1907 to 1910. But again, I was sort of thinking about these like merging of spaces and thinking about the grasses and the ecology that are kind of being removed and unseen or sort of pastiche together with these other kind of modalities of economic violence to produce this like cross transatlantic space. So we have little blue stem, cordgrass, Indian grass, switchgrass, and milkweed that would be sort of in the space of sort of the New York shoreline and interior would be the grasses that would be there. Inside and underneath, merging into the landscape, are images of blueprints of a boil house from Matanzas, Cuba. And then sort of on the Cuban side, if we think about it in that space, we would find Vergata and probably subaltern asters that might be kind of like growing on those close to those shorelines along with different grasses. So I was trying to start to think of like how to make a place kind of like represent both place, to think about what it means to have borders in a time period where borders are effectively ideologically so stringent. What is the claim that has been made and sort of the economic power this country has been built completely with porous borders to certain economic instruments and certain kinds of power and certain kinds of relationships. I'm just gonna check the time. Okay. So this became one of the ways that I wanted to sort of integrate numeracy, right? And sort of like the violence and the abstraction of numeracy into a lot of the work that I was thinking about And the kind of going back to this place of like the 1830s again. So in 1839, the Amistad leaves Cuba, and comes along shore after people attempt to self-manumit in the coastline of Connecticut. And I came across this really beautiful drawing of Fuli, which is in this collection, Sketches of the Amistad Captives, from 1839. And sort of again, thinking about like, how do we start to place people and ideas of really of freedom, but also the language of racial capitalism and economics that have been imposed upon people inside of this space. So you can kind of see in the background this sort of like ghost of the National City Bank of New York, right? Like these sort of traces that are starting to sort of like layer up on themselves. And then these spaces that allow us to kind of see outside of capture. And so as I'm going through these like kind of more mercantile books and sort of like the endless accounting and the ways in which through customs, taxes, and tariffs, there's sort of like how a slave society and the economic function of it is really sort of like born, right? That everybody is sort of getting paid into this. And then again, sort of like what that space of the border, like what it leverages. And so this is called Dear Fuli Writes Their Name Out of the Ledger. So American Lawn, this painting is called American Lawn, and it becomes a bit of this sort of like accumulation of these different ways that I'm sort of trying to rethink this space, right? Like rethink this kind of very pastoral wallpaper, right? That's actually taking place at sort of a military institution. And so here you have a kind of combining of what would be sort of like wild, long-rooted grasses that are being kind of transformed into these very sort of like shallow grasses. This idea of a kind of more instrumentalized border. This island empire, which was again a kind of like 19th century sort of imaginary geography of imperialism that's also sort of like taped on to the United Fruit Company, who kind of becomes part of the story momentarily. Charter. The United Fruit Company actually starts as the Boston Fruit Company. So I was sort of like thinking about how these sort of centers and relationships of economic power and inequality kind of like become transferred. And you can see and hear the way that the stereoscope, I'm trying to kind of, again, sort of merge that into the imagery. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker. This is, I was thinking about like what kind of grass Columbus would have encountered as he kind of like first emerges into this space. Ditch grass and seagrass might be some of them. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way that I think about women in the archive and in the historical record, once again, because especially African diasporic women, enslaved or free, are so hard to trace in the historical record and are usually subsumed in sort of like these layers of different forms of violence. And so again, when I'm kind of dealing with hands that are drawn in graphite, I'm usually talking about sort of like the presence, either in an ancestral sense or in a spirit sense, of Afro and Indigenous women. And that for me is a kind of an important way of designating kind of characters within the field. And I'll share just this one moment from a James DeWolf letter memo, sort of like part of his writings. And I think that there's this place when you're reading in the archive and all of a sudden you get to kind of like the moment of trafficking where you kind of like feel this thing right before and it feels there's like, again, this sort of presence is coming up. So I want a few Negroes for cash on my plantation, say 10 for, and then I have a hard time reading that word, which I wish I could purchase for me some cargo, which may arrive half male and half female, female young Negroes, but not small ones. James DeWolf, 1803. And there's a kind of a lot of moments like that in sort of the collections that I'm looking at. And so I decided not to focus on them because I'm not these men's biographers, and that's not important to me. But I think that I bring it up to say that I only ever kind of like want to position these figures in spaces in which their representation is not through the forced labor that they are being forced in violence to do. And so it allows you, again, this sort of imaginative space to kind of think about different forms of interior. And so in this place, I'm sort of like using the stereoscope, which is very much this sort of like teaching instrument of colonial and sort of like post-colonial looking, like plantation looking, and sort of like turning it away and then sort of like seeing this character that is asymmetrically kind of like transposed inside, right? So what are these ways that we sort of like break the idea of capture in certain ways, like visual capture or other ways of thinking about representation? Part of my research this spring has kind of also just been going to different sites where I have sort of seen or have sort of like looked up, and I'm thinking about sort of like historical trace. And I found this beautiful list of a ski bundle, which was found in, sorry, look back into this, at the Wanton Lyman Hazard House, which is in Newport, Rhode Island, which has had a long-standing historic Black community. And in the ski bundle is sort of like sort of something that is hidden that has sort of like these treasures or wish artifacts of 3 fabric fragments, a human molar, which they didn't show in the exhibition, which I didn't really know why. 3 fragments of Chinese import ceramics, 3 beads, 3 wooden buttons. So I liked this idea of sort of like imagining kind of those things. When I went to the Hazard House, it actually wasn't open. But then when I went to an exhibition at the Mystic Seaport Museum, they had this installation of the Niski bundle that had been recovered in 2005, I think. And so I did get to see it. So I think it's also compelling to me of thinking about the archive and sort of thinking almost in and against it, right? Like, what are the things that, like, I know the things that are written, and, you know, I think in a lot of ways it's sort of, I'm not proving that Atlantic slavery happens, like, we know that, right? And so how do you kind of like find these moments of errantry or relief or exit into different ways of seeing interiority or imagining something? And I also want to say that just in the scope of kind of things I'm looking at, what often comes up is, and again, I'll just say that some of the encounters in terms of trafficking, because of the collections I was looking at, were like quite violent, right? And that there's this moment where we kind of talk about the figure of Mami Wata, right? For Africans who do not make the crossing, right? And it's always sort of like posed as like Africans believed, and I was really thinking about that, like, what if I also just say that I believe, right, that Mami Wata exists, right? Like, what does it mean to kind of like rethink those kinds of tenses or historical changes that happen about the presence or sort of like an authority to kind of find truth in something. So that was a painting I made for that. So what this kind of really arrives in is this form, again, is sort of like challenging, I think, like historical genre painting within sort of like Western canon, right? Where it's sort of like allowing these things I'm finding to kind of collide with each other and sort of like trouble each other. These are sort of more of these instances, again, of this sort of like private and public ecology that I think continues really into the 20th century, from the legacies of how the land has been treated. And so kind of thinking about, there's this sort of really incredible line in the United Fruit Company charter that's like a list of their things that they enable themselves legally to do, I guess, that to manufacture, purchase, or otherwise acquire, to hold, own, mortgage. So it's just sort of like these list of, one of them, it starts with to have goodwill. Like they're both kind of just like physical things and then just sort of ideological things, right? But it kind of going back again to that first image, there's this sort of tension in these processes of land rupture and deforestation around like enclosure and surveillance and the militarization with land, along with sort of like the ecological kind of devastation that has this both like inside and outside, right? Sort of like the colonials being kind of like outside, and these things can kind of occur. So here's another one of the kind of bank, the National City Bank of New York. And this one was in Port-au-Prince. So they sort of like make these kind of architecturally varied versions of their banks. And this would also, this is, you know, I kind of like, if we look at so we're kind of like in the 1930s when we're looking at this, and this is during the time of the American occupation in Haiti. That is precipitated by, in 1914, the US takes a ship to Haiti and sort of goes into their bank vault and takes $500,000 out of their bank and then puts it back on the boat and like leaves. And it was a renegotiation of the bonds that were owed in a lineage sense through the compensation acts that the United States and I think Germany and several other nations kind of like renegotiate the bonds that they now own on Haiti's debt. And so there's like these ways that they kind of like make these financial instruments and these kind of deals, and the possible failure of the Haitian state to meet their financial arrangements are how we kind of come in 1915 for the occupation that lasts that long. And during this time, there's also sort of like this colonial, very kind of corporate imperialism that's occurring through agricultural companies. So I'm kind of thinking about this, all of this in sort of relationship again to New England and to how like New England sometimes in sort of like a historic view seems untroubled by its relationship to this history that it has very much been a part of. And the way that this sort of plantation economy is almost like holding up this house, like, right, this house is a blueprint, this house is sort of a model of what it means to look as a nation, sort of like economically autonomous, right? And inside of this space, there is all of these sort of like histories that in terms of its financial instruments and economic violence, there's like no border, it's sort of porous. This is the Linden Place, the James DeWolf house, and a portrait of one of his plantations in Cuba. And this is actually one of the entries that I was reading from earlier. And what I found curious or not, sort of given sort of colonial history around botanics and specimen, is that there were all these bird drawings at the ends of his pages. But it did make me think a bit about birds, and they'll come back in a moment. So more recently, I was looking at the James Brown, who is one of the founders of Brown University, and his books and all of his entanglements. And this is from one of his ciphering books at the Rhode Island Historical Society. And so I put 3 of these in here just because there's sort of like this entry into sort of a nautical space. And then there are these geometric equations that are kind of like theorems. And then the theorems and these geometric equations essentially get filled in with real places, right? And I think it's kind of, again, interesting to think about that process. And so I came across this list of sort of like early latitudinal studies that take us from Cape Cod to Barbados. And then there's a space where we go from Antigua to Cape Negro on the coast of Guinea, which I took to understand possibly as a spelling of Guinea, right? And then there's like 3 kind of outstanding coordinates of Cape Negro, Island Antigua, and then that goes on in the next page. And I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to sort of look this up based on the coordinates or that may or may not have changed. And a couple of places came up, and there was on the coast of Guinea, right, in a historic sense. And then also a place that is now formally called Cape Negro in Nova Scotia. And there's Cape Negro Island, and sort of like just inside of one of these sort of like land cul-de-sacs, Cape Negro Bay, which is now has been changed in 2023 to Eel Bay. And I'm just going to go ahead. So we had with my cohort a discussion about like whether or not what this might refer to, that kind of Cape Negro, if that is sort of like a racialized term, or if it had to do with sort of like the color of the rock, which we were kind of like, well, then it would be kind of Cape Noir. So I did find this sort of piece of history, and I will, I think there would be more tracing. I don't know if I completely believe this quote or the veracity of it, but there's a harbor very good for vessels, and the head of it has a little river which runs from a distance inland, which I named Port Negro, or named Port Cape Negro, on account of a rock which at a distance resembles one, 4 leagues from it and 4 from Port Mouton. Sorry, it's being cut off by the slide next door. The Cape is very dangerous on account of the rocks. Samuel Champlain, The History of Cape Negro, and Blanche. And so I thought that that was kind of fascinating, that in 1604, again, there's this idea of sort of like an imaginary racializing that's happening within landscape, right? Like that's something that's already kind of like forming. Champlain is from a sailing and sea commerce family, and it looks as though in his biography that before this he would have been in the West Indies. And he also has traveling with him, possibly Mathieu de Costa, who is an Afro-French, he was born in the Azores, and is recorded as being one of the first free Africans in Canada. And so even like that, the strangeness of that, if those that voyage in those time periods kind of like meet up. So again, I'm not trying, and sort of like I'm not really proving this. I'm sort of thinking about like, how did that name get there? Okay, how do these names kind of get places? How do we think about landscape and geography through the same and sort of like through the same process of racialization that is occurring in these other spaces and to people as a process? It made me think, coming back to the birds, at the Blackpoll warbler. Their migration route takes them from Nova Scotia and various points of the Northeast coast, and they have a 3-day nonstop flight to Puerto Rico, the Lesser Antilles, and to South America. There's the image, the Audubon image of the Blackpoll warbler, and I had thought that I had seen it before, but there is a point where the trade winds that are taking the Blackpoll warbler are also very possibly the same flight path that they would have been on as Columbus is sort of arriving. And so Drury and Keith and I have seen these migration maps before, brought observations. So they were looking at the trade winds that the Blackpoll warbler takes in 1491 and 1492. And even brought observations of Columbus to bear when making their early case for ocean crossing songbirds. On their first voyage, Columbus happened to be sailing on the trade winds north of Puerto Rico at the peak of a fall migration in early October. The voyagers observed migrating birds riding the same trade winds that the 3 ships were traveling upon. They took note and adjusted their course to follow the great flock of birds towards the Caribbean islands. So again, these sort of like familiars are right, like that are sort of crossing paths. And I was thinking like, oh, it come at a different time, but like that wouldn't have changed. Somebody else would have made that story.
Make sure you give us some
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start to wrap this up. And so I'm thinking more in having been at Slavery North, thinking both with grasses, but then also really thinking about oceanic space, right? And the sort of place that also allows us to think about landscape. And in looking at the kind of ciphering books, I had been on a beach in Cape Cod, and sort of transposing and thinking about sort of some of these sort of ciphering or navigational symbols as being transposed. And I think the last thing that I'll just kind of really quickly talk about is where I'm kind of landing with this, is that in the map that is here, we also encounter bacalhau, which is another Portuguese term for cod, for salt cod. And so one of the things that sort of like I was thinking about is I've always wanted to do this piece, bacalhau, which I think for many people who are kind of part of the Caribbean diaspora, like saltfish, plays a kind of very particular kind of culinary tradition. And that I was interested in how close these spaces all were to each other, from the kind of like Cape Negro to bacalhau, and that cod in its relationship to sugarcane, in that cod becomes one of the staple food that is sent to the Caribbean to enslaved people. And the salt cod, that is sort of like the primary salt cod that's caught, and it's a very large industry, and it becomes part of triangulation. So ships from New England go to the coast of Africa, then go to the Caribbean, pick up spices, salt. So in the navigation book, when we see Bermuda, Bermuda was a large salt producing colonial space. And so again, this idea of when we think about northern or southern, like these terms are like they've been formed, right? There's not a naturalized space around them. It's that they have been chosen through political economy, through financial instruments, through histories of violence, right? And sort of like, how do we see those in the landscape? And how do we think potentially otherwise, right? But also kind of are able to see them. So I'm gonna leave that there.
Thank you very much. So people online want to type their questions in the chat, or you can unmute another mic. Can I just ask off the top, Alex, do you know the artist who did the original sketches and the paintings that became the wallpaper? Because those paintings of West Point, you're saying, they are very similar to this Irish Canadian's sketches of Montreal in the early 19th century. His name was Robert Sproul. And for me, too, another layer in there that we often don't think about is British and other empires, military cultures were alcoholic cultures. So the British soldiers in the 19th century got a ration of rum a day. So someone like James McGill, who was a West Indian merchant in Montreal, was getting rich off of his shipments of slave-produced rum from the Anglophone Caribbean into Montreal, because he was sitting on top of a garrison after the conquest of the French. And so those depictions of British regulars, as they were called in the Montreal context, would have been read very differently, I think, by the people who lived in Montreal or a space like Quebec City than a foreigner, because when you read primary accounts of the soldiers on the ground, they were a source of great havoc for the people in terms of their drunken, debauched behavior, their overall impoliteness, their sexual coercion of the women in the spaces, their cultivation of prostitution. So it's interesting to me, like, in those cases, we know who made the drawings, and a lot of the people who made drawings like that too were soldiers who were trained in drawing as a part of their ability, especially to do geography, as a part of reconnaissance. So there's even another layer there. So can you take us back to that? Do you know anything about it?
So the only thing that I can know about, I mean, like in here, it's sort of said that the Jacques Gerard Milbeck might be the source of the sort of like published lithographs. But so I'm going to answer this, I think, in a different way. and which is, I think that there's a large circulation of print media that is working and creating kind of like a transatlantic Euro Euro-American sort of like racially white imagination in this time period around how images are circulating. And so with the previous wallpaper that I had been looking at is that is also a Zubair, is the views of the Brazil panoramique. And so that was sort of like drawers who were going on grand tours were making drawings, and whether or not they were related to Zubair, hired by Zubair, or they might have been, and I don't know specifically this history, but just in terms of like their images and how I've kind of like seen them, and they would send them back, and then the company would make paintings of them, and then those would become kind of then turned into prints, right? So you have them coming from different sources. And so I'll say this because you're familiar with like, oh gosh, who's commissioned by William Young? Brunius,
Yeah.
right? So like Brunius
Brunius,
prints that are, there's another sort of French printer at the same time, Grasset, who's like printing almost exactly sort of some of the same kind of fictional like a fictionalized version of some of the kind of characters that we see in the Brunius. And so it really made me wonder about like how these are kind of being circulated, right? And again, like and it's something worth looking into, but the Black figures that are in the Zubair, the West Point scene, those have origins in, I think, like sort of based in sort of Philadelphia abolition, but very racist depictions. And I think that those are not depicted in the same way in here, but it made me curious as like, oh, how are those being transported, right? Like, how are those images of these very similar characters that we can clearly see are sort of in a lineage of them, how are they kind of like making their way back through into this like high luxury wallpaper? And I think also that like about a third, I think, of Zubair's wallpapers are also kind of like bought by American audiences, so they also know that they're kind of like making papers for an audience and transatlantically. So I don't know, that's not directly answering your question because I'm not sure, but I think that it's this another process of kind of like this circulation. And to me, it feels a little bit also like this, again, the colonial project as a project, right? And sort of that it's moving through a kind of transatlantic space to kind of like make this racial imaginary and this sort of like land imaginary as well.
Oh, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about you as an artist and the kinds of your approach to using graphite. I'm lucky enough to be your fellow, and I saw you yesterday, I think, drawing that fish, which is incredible. And so like thinking about how you approach grass, and like just as a person who's not an artist, I'd love to hear you talk about your approach to the different sort of dimensions and the color or lack of color.
So the drawing graphite on Black paper started a couple series ago, and to be honest, I have a harder time now drawing on a white ground. I mostly draw on Black paper. It's sort of like flipped how I see positive and negative shape form in a way that feels like maybe I can go back. I'm not sure. But there's something about the way that the graphite reflects that has this ability to kind of transfer material of knowing and not knowing, because depending on where you are to it. So I was able to take a photograph, and so the even brightness was able to kind of come forward. But most times when you're seeing it in person, you have to position to catch the light right to be able to see it kind of more fully. And so it felt like something that feels more haunted, right? Or that has this sort of like presence to it that is shifting. And to go back to glissant again, but it allows me to kind of think about like opacity and transparency, right? And sort of like what history feels opaque, what feels like transparent, who has a right to opacity. The color, I was gifted blue lapis from my sister who lives in Italy now and sent me this blue, and I waited on it. I didn't really know what to do with it, and so started using it in the series. And so lapis, at least how I've been using it and I grind it, never becomes fully opaque. It's always kind of made through transparency, you kind of layer it up, which is different from how I paint. And so I was like, well, I need a blue that kind of counters this. And so I started to encounter sort of like cyan and different impression and different kinds of blues. So I was thinking about this range of night that is like the spectrum from sort of watery to then sort of like this really synthetic, because most blues are synthetic, right? They don't occur in the natural world very often, except of course, I meant to bring this up, but indigo, right? Which is one of the things that are largely on these mercantile lists that is coming back is indigo. And so, and I did use indigo for the first time, and it's a really interesting color to use. So for me, the tarpaulin in a lot of these becomes a stand-in for both this idea of like kind of colonial cloth. It becomes a stand-in for tarpaulin, which in a kind of contemporary sense is both a material of like constant expansion and manufacture and but also one of kind of disaster and last resort, right? It has like these very different kind of identities to it. And so I think that I was trying to find ways where these blues had this register of like these different kinds of coatings. So that's really what this series, I had never used blue that much in my palette. And so it was really exciting to get to know blue in this way.
So what, I don't know, was there, so Julia, and then we'll end here. Yeah, last two things.
I'm really curious whether you've come across any historical cases of abolitionists using visual representations of some kind of imaginary geography to further the abolitionist cause. Because so I work on text, so like I've seen a lot of texts where they do something like that. For instance, there are many texts where abolitionists will say something like, in the West Indies, like the soil is soaked in blood and sweat and tears, and like the sugarcane itself is like basically it contains blood. And so like people in England who eat sugar, they're basically eating the blood of enslaved people. So it's like it becomes very in these texts, right? You can kind of see these representations of how the geography itself is affected by slavery. So I was wondering whether you've seen any visual representations that do something similar to that.
I'm trying to think. I feel like that's a question I have to kind of go back to and kind of like think through. One of the things that I'll just say is like was interesting, and I don't know who made, and so I think that so much of the abolition through the archive that I've looked at can be a challenging place because there were all these other kind of abolitionist schemas, right? That are like both in, so I'm trying to think back like into the way that I'm thinking about like Alado Equiano in that painting, right? And I think that's a really good question to think about. I think one of the ways I'm thinking about Alado Equiano actually in that particular painting and in relationship to Hegel, and it has to do with this lecture that I was listening to where Fred Moten's, who I think the title says, has this idea of like Alado Equiano whispering into Hegel's ear. And I loved it. And I was like, well, how do you make that into something? But also like that Alado Equiano becomes this wonderful and kind of complicated character, right? As this person who is sort of like representing a true historical figure kind of enters into the historic canon and sort of becomes a liberal Western subject, right? And so some of my thinking is that like there has to be a place to imagine for those of us who don't also follow that path. And I think that's why he's sort of like made of this like blueprint material, right? Because he becomes kind of like this wonderful and sort of challenging blueprint in this account. And so for me, I think that the kind of relationship a little bit to the non-human or non-represented becomes for me a bit more of a way of thinking about freedom, right? And freedom not necessarily just framed in sort of like the kind of like Western liberal colonial sense, but in this sort of like ongoing project of what we don't yet know it to be. And so in the hands in one of the pieces that are floating, I'm actually sort of like using traditional dance moves. And I'm sort of like looking at how dance plays into kind of acts of freedom. So that took me a long time to get there to kind of remember, but that's, I think, one of the ways that I'm thinking about it has to do with sort of like these sort of like movements. I'm thinking about dance. I'm thinking about other forms of sort of like together or care and the way that hands create care. So I think about that in terms of like how people were either organizing or living. And so those become reflected a little bit more in sort of a gestural quality. So I feel like those are places I get less from the archive because I kind of imagine that people were caring for each other and thinking about freedom in various ways all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's also really interesting.
And we'll do the last question here, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, there's far too many points that I would want to ask about. So, so the glissant, the kind of tone in that section of the glissant is exile.
Yeah.
And just thinking about grass, well, I came to glissant again because of Desiree and then also Fred Moulton in Black and Blur. And for him in Black and Blur is thinking of it through sound and the kind of echoic movement between the island spaces in the Caribbean. But then glissant also makes the point of kind of paradoxically, both exile and errantry are entirely about relation, but exile is this thing where community becomes formed as a necessity out of the uprootedness.
Yeah.
And then I mean, you sent me on a whole trip. So just thinking about South African grasses where I'm from, I don't know enough about these ones here to think about, but the lawn grasses there, the invasive lawn grasses are extremely rhizomatic. So if you dig up one section, you're digging up a block, and usually you're rolling it up if you want to plant it elsewhere, and you're moving it together. But it's always going to come in big kind of blocks or patches. And so I'm just wondering if you're thinking about errantry's twin as well.
Yeah.
You know, via glissant, exile.
Yeah.
And how are you thinking about
Yeah.
you know?
And I think there's a part of that where it's like errantry like necessitates rootedness,
Yeah.
right? So I think in some ways this idea of exile, and I know that in part of that reading, like it feels like he's also connecting that kind of directly to like colonial voyage and conquest,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that again, for me thinking about these kinds of grasses that are self-seeding, that require rest sometimes, that require different kinds of forms, or that they are able to kind of like move and create sort of like more provisional kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like, if I'm thinking about it also like from these materials, and then also kind of like thinking about it in history or from archive, because these things that I'm always trying to bring together, right? Like sort of the materials of this, is that like I can, and I think that goes back to a little bit like, I'm not these enslavers biographer, right? Like I can take pieces of what it is provided in the historical record, and then also say like, I can kind of move from it,
Yeah.
right? Like that is, in some ways for me, that is the exile, right?
Yeah.
Like that is and there are sort of like roots that exist because I'm in a place that has an environment and an ecology that has formed the world that I live in, right? And then it's also like the exile is there. So I think that when I was just thinking a moment ago about this other kind of example form, but I guess I'll like land there and then we can kind of keep on talking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Professor Callender. Thank you all for joining us remotely. We hope to see you again for the last talk again for Dr. Kathy Foley-Meyer on May 2nd. I got that right at 3 o'clock. And yeah, take care. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.